make mistakes. That's how you learn. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Obviously, if you're using somebody else's money, be smart about it. So that way you're not tossing their money away, but learn from your mistakes, figure out where you need to adjust course, and then keep making new mistakes. So that way you keep growing.
As an operator, I know other investors are romanticizing multifamily investing, and I'm looking to learn from other investors' mistakes. I know you are too, and you found the right place. Welcome to Myers Methods Presents Multifamily Missteps. Hey everybody, and welcome to Multifamily Missteps. I'm your host Jerome, and I've got Charles Seaman in with me today. Charles, we're in the same state, man. How are things in Carolina?
Good, Jerome. It's good to be on with the fellow North Carolinian.
Well, I think you're a transplant. I don't know if you can claim North Carolina as home now. Come on.
You
I
know
hear
what?
the accent.
I would agree with you. The accent does give it away. I'm originally by way of Brooklyn, New York, and I've been down here about 2.5 years now.
Oh man, well, I'm glad you saw the light and came on down south and got some of this Southern hospitality. So, the listeners, they may have seen you on some of the conferences. They may have seen you on LinkedIn. They may have, but if they haven't, who is Charles and how did he get into multifamily investing?
Sure. So originally, as I said, from Brooklyn, New York, and I was there for the bulk of my life, living and working in Brooklyn and Manhattan. And I was fortunate to probably take a different approach into multifamily than many people do. And the way it was a little bit different was that when I was 20 years old, I started working for a guy who was a successful commercial real estate investor in New York City. And at that time, it wasn't so much because I had the intention of becoming a commercial real estate investor. It was because I was 20 years old and I needed a job. And at that time, it worked out that I was hired by this gentleman who owned several different properties and different businesses. And my role eventually expanded to include managing all of his different properties and businesses. So after being involved for a number of years, I always knew that I gravitated more to the real estate side than the other ones. And for a few reasons, I like the stability with real estate. I like the consistency. And, to be honest, real estate's a little bit easier than some other businesses out there. There's a lot more moving parts when you have full-time staff and when you have different components to it, where real estate's rather simple. And it involves some of the things that I'm really good at, which are dealing with people and negotiating and just building relationships. So those are all things that I enjoy and I take pride in. So my natural tendency was to gravitate to that. So fast forward a little bit, I started that job in 2005. Around 2014 and 15, I dabbled into single family, and not so much because I wanted to be in single family, but I knew that I didn't have the budget to go out there and do commercial deals myself. So as I started dabbling in single family and wholesaling, what I realized were two things. One, I wasn't very good at it. And it's not to say that I couldn't have learned the skills I needed to, but I already had a skill set that was geared for commercial real estate. And secondly, quite frankly, I didn't enjoy it as much. So I quickly fell back from that. And then in 2016, for the first time, I discovered syndication. And as I started looking into that more, I said, okay, this works really well. It allows me to be involved in the deals I want to be involved in. It allows me to use the skill set I already have. And it allows me to use other people's money to get them funded because I didn't have the financial wherewithal to go out and buy $5 and $10 and $20 million properties by myself. So that's my story of how I got started and kind of led me to where I am now.
Beautiful, beautiful. And so you've done a few transactions over the course of your career, right?
Right. So on the
They all went.
syndication side, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say they all went perfectly, just as planned, right?
You know what? I'd love to say that's the case. We have had some that we've been fortunate to run a lot smoother than others, but there's always some learning experiences along the way.
So do you have any? I feel like COVID threw a lot of people for a loop.
COVID definitely did. COVID actually threw us for a loop probably with two different ones, but there's one specific one I think would be a good focal point for today. And that was with a 64 unit property that we purchased. We initially went on the contract in late October 2020, and we ultimately wound up closing it in February of 2021. So, with any contract, one of the things that I would always advise anybody to do, regardless of how fast you believe that you'll be able to close a deal, is to make sure you have an extension built into the contract. And the extension basically gives you extra time to close. Sometimes there's a fee associated with that extension. And sometimes if you negotiate it really well, you may be able to get it for no fee. So, but in either scenario, it's always cheaper and easier to have that extension built into the contract up front than to go back and negotiate when you really need it at the 11th hour. So in this case, we had an extension built into it. We exercised the extension and used it. But the problem is, as we were getting closer to closing, about a week and a half before, we were applying for an agency loan. And being in communication with our lender, I realized, okay, we're not going to be able to close when we need to. So I think it was probably somewhere around like January 15th. And with our contract, we had to close by January 28th. So I said, okay, let me reach out to the broker, let him know we're probably going to need some extra time. What can we do to work this out with the seller so we get an additional extension? Can we give him some additional money toward the purchase price, whatever it might be? So, okay, initially the seller seemed receptive to it when the broker reached out to him. He told us he wanted an additional $50,000, but that the $50,000 would be applied to the purchase price, and not on top of it. So to me, that sounded okay because I was fine with that. I went back and I discussed it with our team, and there was a little bit of hesitation on our team because I think some of the other partners were newer and may not have fully understood what it entailed. So because of that, it probably took us longer than it should have to give the seller a yes or no answer. So by the time I went back to him and said, yes, we'd like to take that, the seller had changed his mind. And now keep in mind, this is January 25th, so we lost some time in between. So now we're about 3 days before closing, when closing was supposed to be. Okay, so at this point, the seller says, nope, I no longer want to do that. You have to close by the 28th as per the contract, or I'm going to hold you in default. Now, at this point, between earnest money deposits, due diligence costs, legal fees, loan applications, we were probably somewhere around $250,000 into the deal. So as you can imagine, my first thought is, oh crap, we're going to lose $250,000 because it seemed pretty bleak and very unlikely that we'd be able to actually close by the 28th. So at that point, I said, okay, well, what options do we have? I went to the broker because he had a good relationship with the seller. And I asked him, what can we do to make it worth his while so that way we get the extension we need and we can close the transaction? And, the broker told me, he said, I spoke with the seller a few times. And he really seems set that it's either going to close by the 28th or you're going to be in default. So at that point, as you can imagine, we're scrambling. Myself and some of the other partners were calling the lender and saying, listen, guys, what can we do? We have to speed the process up. What can we do to close in the next 3 days? And at this point, when you're in scramble mode, you start pulling out all the stops. So we said, okay, let's start thinking of some things that might be out of the box. We reached out to a hard money lender we knew, which wasn't really our first choice, especially on a deal this size. But we said, okay, we need somebody that's going to have $5 or $6 million liquid that can give us money very quickly. And there's only so many people we know with that type of money that will do that. So we reached out to him. We said, listen, what can you do for us here? And transparently, he told me right away, he said, listen, I'm glad to help you, but I want you to know the rate's probably going to be a lot higher than anything you'd like to see. But I said, okay, well, at this point, we're faced with a higher rate. We're potentially losing $250,000. So we went down that route. We discussed it with the hard money lender, and without even really having time to review the deal, solely on relationship and our reputation, he was willing to give us 70% of the purchase price, which to be honest was very generous on 24 hours notice. The only challenge was we really needed 80% because that's what we were banking on. So we still would have had a shortfall of that additional 10%. So that didn't wind up being a good fit. So, okay, at this point, I figured, what options do we have left? Um, this deal involved a broker, so the correspondence goes through the broker. I figured, you know what? Let me see if I can try reaching out to the seller directly, speaking with him, and catching his attention. So I'm over in Charlotte, North Carolina. I live in Charlotte. This particular property is in Charlotte, and the seller has an office in Charlotte because he has another business that he operates and that he works out of. So I figured, okay, let me see if I could stop by the office and try and make a good impression and meet him in person, maybe just reason, beg, borrow, plead, whatever it might be, to try and get extra time. And I stop by the office, go to the receptionist, and they tell me, unfortunately, nope, he's out of the office for the rest of the day. He's at meetings. So I say, okay, that struck out. Now at this
A lot of people want to be profitable multifamily operators, but lack the knowledge, deal flow, experience, and capital to be successful. They often try to overcome these challenges out of order, slowing or eliminating their ability to get the next deal done. We have developed a framework that allows them to gain the knowledge they need to find profitable deals. When they use our system, they create time and location freedom, as well as the generational wealth they desire for their family. The Multifamily Kickstart program has proven to be the fastest way to establish credibility and build a profitable apartment portfolio. Hop over to jeromemyers.co to find out more information.
Now, at this point, this is January 27th. We had to close by the 28th. So we're within 1 day of the required closing by the contract. Okay, so now I'm thinking to myself, well, so far we're striking out on all fronts. I can't seem to get his attention. I went to his office to try and meet him in person. That didn't work. So I said, okay, what other options do we have left? And I decided to make a last ditch Hail Mary effort. And I sent him an email directly, which I copied the broker on, but I went straight to him. And I said, listen, we want to get this deal done. We didn't come this far to fall that short. And we want to work with you. We understand, your position, but we want you to understand ours as well. And we want to work in good faith to get this done together. So I threw out 5 different options in the email that I thought could potentially entice him. One of which was the additional $50,000 credited to the purchase price, which I was pretty sure he wasn't going to go for that, being he'd already backed out on that one. But I said, let's try just in case. I threw out an additional $50,000 on top of the purchase price to see if we could get the time, because I said, well, at this point, we may as well try whatever we need to, even if it's $50,000. It's better than losing $250,000 that's non-refundable at this point. So let's try that. The seller was very big on taking care of his staff at the property. He had a very good relationship with them. So we threw out basically a severance package of, $200,000 that we'll pay out to the staff as you want. And we even included one that had part of our percentage in the general partnership and said, listen, we'll leave you in the deal as a partner. You get part of our percentage and leave you in there. So my expectation or my hope was that he would see the email, it would catch his attention and first get a reply, which it did, and that he would give us an indication that maybe 1 or 2 of those options were what he was favoring. So the good news is I caught his attention and I did get a reply. To my surprise, he wanted some combination of all 5 of the options that I offered, which I wasn't really expecting to do that. I said, well, I got the reply. That was good. But I said, boy, this may wind up being a lot more costly than I thought. So we wound up getting him to agree to take an additional $50,000 toward the purchase price, an additional $50,000 on top of the purchase price, just as an extension fee, and part of our ownership. So I said, okay, we gave away a lot more than I would have liked. The good news is it still got the deal done. It got it across the finish line, but it was a learning lesson. And here was the lesson that we had. So I think part of the problem with our earlier transactions is that we would wait until we were about halfway through our due diligence period to submit the loan application and to start our offering docs. And the reason we did that is because once you lay out that money, you don't get it back. So we wanted to be confident that we were going to move forward with the transaction before we started laying out, $20,000, $30,000 in loan application and legal fees. So what we realized going forward is that, okay, you know what, this is just the cost of doing business. And no, we don't want to just lose $20,000 or $30,000 on legal fees and loan applications, but that has to be an expense we're willing to accept because that's the cost of doing business in this space. So the lesson learned is that we had to be willing to accept that and to start the loan application and to start the offering docs as soon as the PSA got signed. So that way something like this never happened again. And needless to say, those last 2 days before we worked out that agreement were probably the most two stressful days of my professional life. I generally tend to like stress. Like there are people who work well with chaos, and that describes me pretty well. But I have to admit, these probably pushed my threshold a little further than I would have liked. So I'd rather not repeat them, and I'm glad to have learned a bit from them.
Wow. So, trying to be wise on when you spend money in a deal is, I think, really important because your pursuit costs can put you out of business if you're not careful in the beginning.
Right.
And you're saying, hey, we know pretty early on whether or not the deal is going to close. And that's based on our physical due diligence and our financial reviews. And so we able to accelerate it and get those offering documents started 15 days in versus 30 or 45?
So we were starting them about 15 days in previously, but even that was too long. And that was really what caused us the issue, because with the agency loan, it took, almost 60 days to close. And being we started at 15 days in of a 30-day due diligence period and then 30 days more to close, it put us in a bad spot as we came to the closing date. So we realized that we have to start them as soon as the contract is signed. And I know that other buyers do that. We were always reluctant to, because we just, as you said, we didn't want to spend money foolishly and say, okay, we found something during due diligence, we're not going to move forward. But now we've changed our process and our mentality to say, okay, you know what, we have to do that, because if we don't, we're just not going to be competitive and we're not going to be able to close these deals in the time frame that we need to. Now, the downside to it is if you find something during due diligence that's a major red flag, then you may wind up spending that money and not getting it back.
And so how long is your due diligence period in your contract?
We typically are for a 30-day period. So with this particular deal, it was 30 days. And we waited until about halfway through that period before we submitted the loan application and started the offering docs.
And so you're doing the 30 and 30 for due diligence, 30 for financing?
Right.
Yeah, that makes it tough, especially if the agencies are backed up.
Right. And we also had a 30-day extension in this one, which we used, and that was for an additional $50,000 toward the purchase price, but it wound up being a little bit backlogged just because with the timing of the deal at the end of the year and through the holiday season, I think everything was slow. And especially at the end of 2020 and early 2021, third-party reports were still taking a while. They're still taking a while now, but they were taking even longer then because there were so many access restrictions in different areas with COVID.
Yeah. That seller is pretty hard on you guys. Most sellers are a little more accommodating. That was tough.
He was very hard on us, but it what I've always found in life is that the hardest lessons are the best teaching points. Mm-hmm. You don't learn anything when something goes smooth. So with something like that, it'll stick out in my head and I'll say, okay, let me make sure never to do that again.
Yeah. So I want to go back to one more thing, just make sure I'm clear on it. So your extension period was not guaranteed, the 30-day.
So the 30 days was, and we had used that, but just with the delay of the holiday season and the third-party reports and us starting things, probably midway through the due diligence period versus right at the beginning, that caused a delay that led to us not being able to hit that closing. Now, we wound up closing 1 week after what the last day of that extension period would have been. But we figured, okay, let's just try and negotiate that additional extension. And that little extension after would cost us a lot of money.
It did. So one thing that I've seen people who are clever do is say business days instead of calendar days
Right.
to get more time.
That can go a long way, and depending on the seller that you're dealing with, that can often give you an advantage without people realizing it's an advantage. However, the seller we were dealing with was pretty sharp, and he was an accountant by trade, so he naturally looked over everything pretty meticulously, and there was no such case with that.
I love it, Charles. This was a great one. We haven't talked about sellers being hard nosed with us on this podcast yet, so this is a great one for the listeners. Last question, man. What words of wisdom do you have for our listeners?
Make as many mistakes as you can. So I'm going to use advice that may be a little bit unconventional, but make mistakes. That's how you learn. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Obviously, if you're using somebody else's money, be smart about it, so that way you're not tossing their money away. But learn from your mistakes, figure out where you need to adjust course, and then keep making new mistakes, so that way you keep growing.
Wow, that's good. I haven't heard that one before. I don't like making mistakes, which is why I try to learn from everybody else's. But yeah, I mean, if you're not making mistakes, you're probably not playing a big enough game, right? That's the only way that you actually learn and grow. So that's wonderful, man. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Jerome, thanks for having me.
You made it to this juncture, so you really love what we shared on this episode of Myers Methods Presents Multifamily Missteps. Do us a favor, give us a 5-star rating, give us a review, and share this with somebody who's interested in multifamily investing. Until the next time, the pack is with you.